Next Monday will mark 100 days since Tony Abbott's government came to power, and the coalition has quickly found itself in turbulent political times. It's been rattled by a series of missteps, from the Indonesian spying saga to the row over schools funding and this week's furore over the coming closure of Holden's car plants in Australia. Amidst all the drama, there's been a marked turnaround in the coalition's fortunes, at least in the opinion polls. They're showing that if an election were held tomorrow, the coalition would be turfed out. It's the most dramatic slump for a new government in 40 years of polling. Party insiders are blaming the mess they say they inherited from Labor. But as political correspondent Sabra Lane reports, the government's performance is also under scrutiny.
A government of no surprises and no excuses. The boats will be stopped. The budget will be on track for a believable surplus. The time for campaigning has passed. The time for governing has arrived.
More than 3 months on from the exuberance of Tony Abbott's election night victory, few, if any, of the party's faithful would have guessed the coalition's honeymoon would be over. In fact, it never happened. While Mr Abbott is revered within the party for leading the Liberals back to power after only 6 years on the opposition benches, the voting public doesn't appear to share the same adoration.
Madam Speaker.
It's been a rough 3 months for the fledgling administration, with the row over MPs' entitlements, the Indonesia spying allegations, the Gonski education furore, the failed foreign takeover bid for GrainCorp, to the Holden closure. Opinion polls show a 4 to 5% swing against the government.
We've never seen that before in 40 years of polling. What normally happens after an election is the government gets a reasonable honeymoon, and it's averaged over the last 40 years up to a year, sometimes 2 years in the case, or 3 years in the case of Bob Hawke. So this time, not only has there not been a honeymoon where the swing post-election has gone to the government, but the fact is the swing is going the other way, and I think that's a big worry for the government.
John Sturton is the research director at polling company Nielsen.
You can see a clear trend down against the government.
While his organisation's conducted one opinion poll since the election, he's crunched the numbers on all opinion polling before and after September 7 and analysed the results.
It's clear that in the last 4 or 5 weeks that the trend has turned strongly against the government. Their primary vote is down, and two-party the swing is 4 or 5% against the government just in the 3 months since the election, and that's extremely unusual.
Graham Morris was Prime Minister John Howard's Chief of Staff. He's been closely associated with the Liberal and National parties for more than 30 years.
The polls have turned. The government's very conscious of that. But, there's no election on Saturday, thank goodness.
He says the government's popularity's dropped as a consequence of dealing with tricky policies that have been bubbling away under Labor and have exploded under Tony Abbott's prime ministership, like the Gonski education deal.
The new school funding model is a complete shambles.
Mr Morris also nominates the GrainCorp decision, the Qantas ownership equity row, the same-sex marriage debate and Holden's decision to close as factors for the slump.
They've now sort of arrived with a bang on the agenda, and they are tough things to deal with. Look, I think the government has to be very, very careful about its two basic messages. One is to deliver what they promised, and the other is we're open for business. Now, some of these things are making some of those messages a bit fluffy, but I think after about 12 months, when the government is onto its own proper agenda instead of tidying up the Labor Party mess, I think things will settle down and be a little easier for the government.
Yet pollster John Sturton believes something else is at play, that voters were itching to boot Labor in September but weren't convinced about Tony Abbott as Prime Minister.
Every other opposition leader who's won an election in the last 40 years has been in strong positive territory. Tony Abbott was in negative territory. So in a sense, he was the Prime Minister that we weren't sure we wanted. We were sure we wanted to get rid of the Labor government, but we weren't sure we wanted this Prime Minister. Expectations were low, and so far, in voters' minds at least, the government's not performing.
Some of it's a case of unlucky timing, like the Indonesia spying allegations. The revelations occurred early in the government's term, and it's had to wear the blame for something that happened under Labor's watch, though some are uncomfortable with the PM's early efforts in handling it. Yet on some issues the government should have been on top of, it's made a hash of explaining it to the public. Insiders acknowledge it, pointing to the education and Holden debates, warning ministers must lift their game. As the polls show, this government, unlike other newly elected administrations, has no political capital to expend on stuff-ups in decision-making or implementation. And that no doubt will be on the minds of ministers during the Christmas break as they contemplate 2014, the year in which the coalition's promised cuts and policy change.
Of stalling, of spoiling and of outright sabotaging the government's legislative agenda.
The government had hoped to end the year with tax abolition trophies, but the Senate's thwarted plans to scrap the carbon and mining taxes as the Greens and Labor have used their majority numbers to block it. Mr Morris believes the new Senate that'll sit from next July will make it smoother for the government and that the coalition will move into a phase of implementing its own policies.
Well, I think the new Senate will shift from herding elephants to herding cats. It will take some negotiating skills. But there are some of these new people coming in. They're not Labor ratbags, they're not, fairies at the bottom of the garden. They are Conservative people who have some strong centre-right views.
Tony Abbott's political agility is being tested.
Keeping up with Queensland stuff.
In responding to Holden's decision to close from 2017.
I think pragmatic federalism.
Financial assistance for South Australia and Victoria was discussed at a meeting today of the Prime Minister, state and territory leaders.
We will make an announcement early next week that I think will help to restore confidence in the areas most impacted by the impending departure of Ford and Holden.
He's considering fast-tracking infrastructure projects in response. South Australia says assistance will be crucial, as up to 45,000 people work in Holden's supply chain, many in component supply businesses.
Chillingly for us, those same component suppliers say that only about 25% of them will make that journey to the end of that period. And being able to survive beyond that period.
Sabra Lane reporting there.